There are mornings when the past feels close enough to touch. Not like a memory, but like a hand pressed flat against glass, warm and real and desperate. This was one of those mornings. I stood at the entrance of Aurora, the kind of restaurant where the tablecloths cost more than my weekly groceries, and the wine list read like a novel with no ending. My uniform was freshly pressed, my hair pulled back in the precise chignon that the manager, Mr. Fontaine, required of all front-of-house staff. My name tag caught the early light, Evelyn, and for a moment, I stared at it like it belonged to someone else. 3 years had a way of doing that, making you feel like a stranger inside your own name. I adjusted my collar and pushed through the service entrance, breathing in the familiar rush of garlic, butter, and something sweet from the pastry station. The kitchen was already alive, pans clanging, someone barking orders in French-accented English, the low percussion of knives against cutting boards. This was my world now. Controlled chaos, predictable schedules, tips counted in silence at the end of every shift. It was safe. That was the only thing that mattered anymore. Evelyn. My coworker Dana appeared at my elbow, her dark ponytail swinging. Table 7 is already asking for still water, and it's not even noon. I've got it, I said automatically, reaching for a pitcher from the station. That was how I moved through life now, automatically. Wake at 6, drop the twins at Mrs. Hargrove's 3 floors down, take the bus to Aurora, carry water and wine, and carefully arrange plates to people who never quite looked at me, then reverse the whole thing before nightfall. Repeat. Sue and Leah had turned 3 in February. They had my stubbornness in someone else's eyes, dark, deep-set, the kind that seemed to hold more thought than a child should carry. I had learned to stop flinching whenever I looked at them directly, mostly. The lunch service moved in its usual rhythm. I poured, I smiled, I disappeared between courses the way good servers are supposed to. By 2 o'clock, the dining room had thinned, and I allowed myself a breath. Standing near the host stand with a quiet glass of water, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from the effort of existing normally for hours at a stretch. That was when the front door opened. I didn't look up immediately. Guests arrived all the time without announcement. Walk-ins, late lunches, the occasional business meeting that bled past the hour. I heard the subtle shift in the room before I processed it. A tightening, like the air pressure changing before a storm. Dana straightened where she stood near the dessert station. Mr. Fontaine materialized from his office with unusual speed and moved toward the entrance with his best professional warmth already arranged on his face. I looked up. There were 3 of them. 2 men I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, watchful, occupying the periphery of the entrance with the practiced stillness of people paid to notice everything. And 1 man at the center, who moved as though the space rearranged itself around him without being asked. My water glass nearly slipped. He was not what Soul had made him. Or perhaps he was exactly that, only more so. More composed, more unhurried. More present in a way that made everything else in the room recede slightly. He wore charcoal gray, tailored close, a single button fastened at the wrist. His profile was sharp and quiet as he scanned the room with the reflexive calm of someone who checked every entrance before they ever considered sitting down. Minho. My heart didn't race. It stopped. And then it started again at a different tempo, wrong and too loud, as if my body had forgotten the rhythm it was supposed to keep. He hadn't seen me yet. His attention was moving across the room in that systematic way I remembered. Not paranoid, never obviously so, but deliberate. Cataloging. I watched Mr. Fontaine extend his hand, and Minho accept it briefly, before his gaze continued its survey of the dining room. I turned away, pressed my back to the side of the host stand and breathed. He doesn't know you're here. He hasn't seen you. You are invisible. You have been invisible before. 3 years of practice at disappearing should have made this easier. I set my water glass down with great care, not trusting my grip. My mind was already moving through calculations. Exits, timing, whether I could reach the kitchen without crossing the central floor. If I could get to the back corridor, I could tell Dana I was unwell. Mr. Fontaine would be occupied with the table. I could leave through the service door and not come back until... Evelyn. Mr. Fontaine's voice, behind me, closer than expected. Table 2 has just been seated. They've requested our best lunch service. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. Then I turned, smoothed my expression into the professional neutral I had spent 3 years perfecting, and picked up 2 menus from the stand. Table 2 was directly beside the window. Prime positioning, natural light, a view of the courtyard, the kind of table reserved for guests who mattered. The 2 men who had arrived with Minho took up their post at a slight distance, at the small corner bar, and I registered them in my peripheral vision the way I had once learned to register danger. Peripherally, calmly, without looking directly. I walked toward the table. Minho was already seated, one arm resting along the back of the chair, with a looseness that somehow didn't read as casual so much as controlled. His phone, one of 2 on the table, I noticed, was face down. He was speaking in low Korean to one of his men, something brief and precise, and whatever it was made the other man nod once and step back immediately. I placed the menus. My hands were steady. I was proud of my hands. "Good afternoon," I said, and my voice came out level and professional, aimed at the table in general, at no one in particular. "Still or sparkling water to start?" The pause that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It felt considerably longer. When I finally looked up, because protocol required it, because Mr. Fontaine's training demanded eye contact, Minho was watching me with an expression I could not immediately name. It wasn't shock. It wasn't warmth. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either. The absolute stillness of a person who has learned never to let what happens inside reach the surface. His eyes were exactly as I remembered them, dark and steady and too perceptive for comfort. "Evelyn," he said. Not a question. Just my name, spoken in his voice, in that low, unhurried register that I had once fallen asleep to. And I felt it move through me like something physical. "Still or sparkling, sir?" I repeated. Something shifted in his expression, so subtle I almost missed it. Almost. "Still," he said. "Please." I went to retrieve the water. My legs carried me to the station, and my hands lifted the pitcher and I poured without spilling a single drop, which was remarkable given that my entire ribcage seemed to be compressing from the inside. "He doesn't know. He can't know. He only knows your name. You've always been careful." I returned to the table, poured his water, poured for the 2 men who had taken the secondary seats, recited the day's specials with the precise, unhurried clarity Mr. Fontaine had trained into me over 18 months. Minho listened without interrupting. His eyes didn't leave my face. When I finished, he said, "I'll have the sea bass, and a moment when you can." The last 4 words were quiet, deliberate. The kind of sentence that isn't quite a request. "Of course, sir," I said. "I'll put that order in." I walked back toward the kitchen at a normal pace, not hurried, not fleeing. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind me, I pressed my back against the wall beside the pass-through and breathed with real effort for the first time in 10 minutes. Dana glanced over from the salad station with a raised eyebrow, and I shook my head slightly, "Not now." And she returned to her work with the blessedly uncurious nature of someone in the middle of a service rush. I needed to think. 3 years. I had built 3 years of careful, quiet distance between that life and this one. Seoul, the apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the silk dresses I never asked for, the phone calls where I heard things no ordinary person was meant to hear. I had left all of it behind on a Tuesday morning when he was in a meeting, and I had 2 suitcases and a secret I had only just confirmed the night before. I had not looked back. I had told myself it was the only way to protect them. I believed it. I still believed it. But he was 20 feet away, and I had work to do. And Mrs. Hargrove would have Sue and Leah until 6 o'clock. I pushed off the wall, straightened my uniform, picked up the order pad. When I came back through the kitchen door to check on the adjacent tables, I moved efficiently along the periphery of the room. I was careful. I was professional. I was 3 years of practiced invisibility. But as I reached the far end of the service corridor, I passed the coat alcove near the host stand, and my elbow caught the edge of the display shelf, the one that held the small framed menu artwork, and the silver frame slid and dropped, and struck the tile floor with a sound that rang clear and sharp across the quiet of the post-rush dining room. Every head turned, including his. And this time, when Minho looked at me, I saw something beneath the stillness, something that cracked through the controlled surface for just a fraction of a second. Recognition, yes, but underneath that, something else. Something that looked, impossibly, like relief. I crouched to retrieve the frame. My hands were no longer as steady as I'd imagined. When I stood, he was still watching. And I understood, with a cold and certain clarity, that there would be no slipping out through the service entrance today. I made it through the rest of his lunch on something that wasn't quite composure. It was closer to the performance of it, the hollow shell of professionalism worn over a body that had forgotten how to be still. He ordered nothing else after the sea bass. He didn't summon me again for the moment he had mentioned, and part of me constructed a fragile hope that perhaps he had reconsidered. Perhaps he would leave with his 2 silent men, and his 2 phones and his charcoal gray suit, and I would close out my tables and take the bus home and hold my daughters and pretend this afternoon had never occurred. That hope lasted until I began clearing the dessert course from table 9, and Dana appeared at my shoulder with an expression she reserved for difficult situations. "The gentleman at table 2 asked Mr. Fontaine for your section tomorrow," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Specifically, by name." I set the dessert plate down without sound. "He's also left something at the host stand," she added. "For you." I didn't go to the host stand until after he had gone. I watched from the kitchen window, a narrow rectangle of glass above the prep counter, as Minho rose from the table with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once rushed for anything in his life. One of his men moved ahead to the door. The other fell into step slightly behind and to his left. The formation was so practiced it looked almost natural, the way birds move in pattern without visible instruction. He paused at the host stand, said something brief to Mr. Fontaine, who nodded with the excessive deference he reserved for guests of consequence. And then, without glancing back toward the kitchen, Minho walked out. The black car waiting at the curb was the kind with no visible badge on the hood and windows tinted past the legal limit. It pulled away smoothly and unhurriedly, and I stood at the kitchen window until it had rounded the corner entirely. The envelope at the host stand had my name on it, in handwriting. I recognized the way you recognize a scar. Not fondly, but immediately, and without effort. Inside was a card. No letterhead, no number, no identifying mark of any kind. Just 8 words in the same hand. "I think we should talk. You know where." I folded the card in half, then again. Dropped it into my apron pocket and went to finish my closing duties. Mrs. Hargrove lived in 4B with 2 cats and a generosity she never asked to be thanked for. When I knocked that evening, she opened the door before I'd finished the second knock, which meant the girls had been watching for me through the hallway gap the way they always did in the last hour before I arrived. They hit me at knee height simultaneously. "Mama," Leah's voice, high and certain. Sue grabbed my hand with both of his and said nothing, which was his way. He saved his words, and when they came, They were exact. I crouched in the hallway and held them both and pressed my face briefly into the warm space between their heads where they smelled like baby shampoo and something unnameable and entirely theirs. My throat tightened in the way it always did when I held them after a day that had cost me something, as if my body understood that this was the thing that mattered and everything else was negotiable. "Good day?" Mrs. Hargrove asked from behind them. "Fine," I said. "Thank you, Eleanor. Truly." She waved a hand. "They helped me repot the fern. Leah has opinions about soil." I almost smiled. She has opinions about everything. Upstairs, in our apartment, small, clean, enough, I made dinner while the twins sat at the kitchen table with their crayons. The routine of it was medicinal. Water boiling, pasta measured, the particular rhythm of two small people narrating their own drawing processes at full volume. Sue held up his paper. He'd drawn 3 figures, a small one in the middle, 2 taller ones on either side. "That's us," he said. "Me, Leah, and you, Mama." "It's perfect," I said. He studied it for a moment with those deep, serious eyes. "Who's this?" He pointed to a 4th figure he'd drawn smaller, and to the side, slightly separate from the group. My spoon stilled in the pot. "I don't know, baby," I said. "Who do you think it is?" He looked at it for a long time. "Someone who's supposed to be in the middle," he said finally, with the uncomplicated logic of a 3-year-old, "but doesn't know yet." I turned back to the stove. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in the dark and listened to the twins breathe through the baby monitor, a habit I'd kept long past the age most parents abandoned it. And I stared at the ceiling and had the conversation with myself that I had avoided having since 2:30 that afternoon. He had found me. Whether by accident or design, the result was the same. Minho knew where I worked, knew I was in this city, and had left a message that was simultaneously an invitation and a demonstration of patience. He could have followed me. He could have had someone follow me. He could know already where I lived. The thought moved through me like cold water. But if he knew about Sue and Leah, the message would not have been 8 careful, neutral words. It would have been something else entirely, something that looked less like restraint and more like the particular silence that preceded consequences. He didn't know, which meant I had time. A small window of it, uncertain and probably closing, but time nonetheless. The rational decision was clear. Request a schedule change from Mr. Fontaine in the morning, avoid the restaurant for the period of whatever business had brought Minho to this city, and wait. Men like him had obligations and movements and reasons to be elsewhere. He would not stay indefinitely. I told myself this until somewhere near 3 in the morning when I almost believed it. Then I thought about the card. You know where. The apartment in Gangnam-gu, with the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city spread below like something that had been arranged for our specific viewing. I had loved those windows before I understood what living inside them truly meant. I thought about the morning I had left. The way I had folded 2 dresses into a bag, alongside the only photograph I allowed myself to keep. Not of him, but of the view from those windows at dawn. The city still dark, and the Han River catching the first light in long silver lines. I had taken it because I wanted to remember that beauty and danger could occupy the same space, a lesson I intended to carry forward. I had not expected to need to apply it so soon. The next morning I dressed carefully. Not for him, I told myself this firmly, but because careful dressing was a form of armor, and I had learned to use every form available to me. I chose the navy uniform over the white, pulled my hair back with precision, and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror long enough to confirm that I appeared, at minimum, like a woman who had slept. I dropped Sue and Leah at Mrs. Hargrove's. Leah immediately began explaining her plans for the fern. Sue paused at the door and looked up at me with an expression of such open, quiet study that it stopped my breath for a moment. "You look different, Mama," he said. "Different how?" He considered this. "Like before a storm," he said, but not scared, just ready. I kissed the top of his head. "Go help your sister with the fern." He went. I stood in the hallway for a moment after Mrs. Hargrove's door closed, my hand flat against the wall, gathering myself the way I had learned to gather myself, from the inside out, starting with the breath, moving outward until the surface held. Then I walked to the bus stop and rode to Aurora, and pushed through the service entrance into the smell of garlic and butter and the morning kitchen, and I told myself today would be manageable. Minho was already at table 2 when the lunch service opened. He had arrived before the first guests. He was drinking coffee, black, no sugar, which I remembered without wanting to, and reading something on his phone with the absolute focus he gave to everything. He didn't look up when I entered the dining room, but one of his men, standing near the bar, met my eyes immediately. They had been waiting. The card in my apron pocket, I had brought it back, not knowing why, felt suddenly heavier than paper had any right to be. I served him coffee. Not because Mr. Fontaine asked me to, though he did, with the particular eyebrow raise he used when important guests required delicate handling, but because retreating into the kitchen would have announced something I wasn't prepared to announce. Avoidance, when performed badly, communicates more than presence does. I had learned that in Seoul, watching how people moved around Minho's orbit, how the ones who were afraid showed it not in their faces, but in the geometry of their exits. So I walked to table 2 with a fresh carafe, and I refilled his cup with a steady hand. He looked up this time. "You didn't come," he said. Quiet, not accusatory, simply observing a fact. "I work mornings," I said. "Will you be having the full service today, or just coffee?" A pause, the kind that had texture to it. "Sit down, Evelyn." "I'm working, Mr. Kwon." Something moved across his expression at the name. Mr. Kwon, formal and deliberate as a closed door. But he absorbed it without visible reaction. That had always been his particular discipline, receiving things without showing where they landed. "Then I'll order," he said. "Whatever takes the longest to prepare." I wrote it down. Went to the kitchen, stood at the pass-through, and breathed through the next 4 minutes while the morning chef looked at my ticket and announced that the short rib required 45 minutes minimum. Good, I thought. 45 minutes of controlled distance. What I had not accounted for was the lull between the breakfast clear and the lunch rush, that quiet valley in the service day when the dining room thinned, and Mr. Fontaine retreated to his office, and Dana took her break, and the restaurant existed in a temporary suspension that left me with very few legitimate reasons to stay in motion. Minho knew the rhythm of restaurants. He had chosen his timing deliberately. By 11:15, I had reorganized the host stand twice, polished a section of glassware that didn't need polishing, and was working through a mental inventory of every possible task that could keep me legitimately occupied when he said, from across the room, without raising his voice, "I'm not going to do anything, Evelyn. I just want to talk." The dining room was almost empty. His voice carried the way quiet things do in open spaces. I set down the glass I was holding, crossed the room, stood at the edge of his table with my order pad held against my chest like something between a prop and a shield. "You have about 30 minutes, I said, "before the lunch tables fill." He gestured to the chair across from him. I didn't sit. He didn't push. "You look well," he said. "Thank you. You cut your hair." 2 years ago. He absorbed this, the information and its implication, that I had been living a life with seasons and changes in increments of time he had no record of. His hands rested on the table, perfectly still, and I noticed what I always noticed about Minho's hands, how the stillness of them was not relaxation, but restraint, the way a river is still on the surface when it's moving fastest underneath. I looked for you, he said. The words landed somewhere I hadn't prepared for them. I know, I said, because I had known. There had been a period, the first 6 months, when I had been careful to a degree that exhausted me. New city, cash transactions, a name that existed in a few official records, but was otherwise unremarkable. I had been thorough. I had needed to be. And then you disappeared so completely, he continued, that I understood it wasn't an accident. No, I said, it wasn't. He looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the courtyard light shifted as clouds moved across the morning sun, and the restaurant dimmed briefly and then brightened again. And in that brief dimness, his face looked older than I remembered. Not aged, precisely, but weighted, carrying something. Why? He said. One word. But the architecture of it was complex. It held more questions than it asked. And I knew him well enough to understand that he already suspected answers he wasn't certain he wanted confirmed. I thought about Sue's drawing from the previous evening. The figure standing to the side, separate, that was supposed to be in the middle but didn't know yet. Because it was necessary, I said. For whom? For me. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement and I almost missed it, but I had spent a year learning to read what Minho allowed to surface, and it was unmistakably there. Something that in another man might have been hurt, rerouted through discipline into something colder. Are you in trouble? He asked. Is someone... No. I said it clearly. I'm not in trouble. I'm not in danger. I have a good life here, Minho. A real one. The use of his name was involuntary. I felt it leave my mouth and watched it reach him. Watched the slight change in his posture. The fractional shift of someone who has been standing braced against something, and suddenly is not. A real one, he repeated. I didn't mean... No, he said. You meant it. That's fine. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. I'm here for 3 weeks. Business. I understand. I'm not here for you, he said. And then, with the particular honesty that had always unsettled me about him, the way he occasionally said the true thing without ornament. That's not entirely accurate. I saw you yesterday by chance, but I would like to see you again by choice. The dining room door opened. A couple, early for lunch, guided to the far section by Dana, who had reappeared from her break. The ordinary machinery of the restaurant resuming around us. I have to work, I said. I know. He reached into his jacket, not inside, which was where I had once learned men like him kept things that weren't meant to be seen, but the outer breast pocket, and set a phone on the table. A simple model, not one of the two I'd observed yesterday. New, still in the partial wrapping. In case you want to reach me, no obligation. I looked at the phone. I didn't touch it. The short rib will be ready soon, I said. I'll bring it when it's up. I thought about the phone for 6 days without touching it. 6 days during which Minho came to Aurora for lunch each afternoon, not always to my section, which I understood was deliberate, a form of pressure released rather than applied. Sometimes he sat at the bar, once at a table near the window that Dana served, and I watched from across the room as she handled him with cheerful professionalism. And he was courteous and unremarkable and tipped generously. And I felt something irrational move through me that I refused to examine by name. He did not approach me again. He did not send messages through Mr. Fontaine. He was simply present, and his presence was a kind of conversation conducted without words, patient and deliberate, and impossible to fully ignore. On the 4th day, I came home to find the arrangement of white peonies outside my apartment door. No card, no name. Only the flowers, wrapped simply in brown paper, the kind that came from an actual florist rather than a grocery stand. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I brought them inside and put them in the only vase I owned, a plain glass one, nothing like what I'd had in Seoul, and set them on the kitchen table where the twins immediately abandoned their crayons to investigate. "Pretty," Leah announced with the authority of someone whose opinion settled matters. Sue touched one petal with a careful fingertip. "Who sent them, Mama?" "Someone I used to know," I said. He looked at me. "The one from my drawing?" I turned to the sink, ran water for the pasta. "Eat first," I said. "Then bath. Then story." He let it go. He was 3, and he was perceptive, and he understood, in the wordless way small children understand things, that some questions were being held rather than answered. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after they were asleep, and I held the unopened phone, and I thought about all the reasons not to call. They were good reasons, solid, serious, built from 3 years of deliberate living. Then I thought about 6 days of white peonies, and a man who had once moved an entire dinner service to accommodate an allergy I had mentioned once, casually, and never repeated, who had learned the names of my 3 closest friends before I'd introduced him, because he believed in knowing the people who mattered to the people who mattered to him, who had terrified me and steadied me, and ultimately made me understand that loving someone and being safe with them were sometimes 2 entirely different things. I opened the phone. His number was already in it. 1 contact. No name, just a small mark. A single asterisk. I typed, "The peonies were unnecessary." The reply came in under 40 seconds. "I know. How are you?" I stared at the screen. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary nighttime rhythms. A car, someone's television 1 floor up, the distant sound of the bus making its last run. "I'm fine," I typed. "Don't send more flowers." "Understood. Can I take you to dinner?" My thumbs hovered. "That's not a good idea." His response took longer this time. Nearly 2 minutes, which for Minho was unusual. He was not a man who hesitated over words. "Probably not," he wrote back. "I'm asking anyway." I set the phone down on the table, pressed both palms flat against the wood, breathed. The peonies were already opening in the warmth of the apartment, petals loosening toward full bloom, and the kitchen smelled faintly sweet, and entirely at odds with the careful, unadorned life I had built around myself. I picked the phone back up. "1 dinner," I wrote. "Somewhere public." The asterisk contact went quiet for a moment. Then, "Tomorrow. 7. I'll send an address." I turned the phone face down on the table. From the monitor on the counter, I heard Leah shift in her sleep and murmur something shapeless and content. Then Sue, 1 small sound, settling deeper. I sat in the kitchen with the peonies and the cooling quiet of the apartment, and the knowledge, certain and uncomfortable as a stone in a shoe, that I had just opened a door I had spent 3 years learning how to keep closed. The restaurant he chose was nothing like Aurora. It was smaller, tucked into a side street in the kind of neighborhood where the buildings leaned slightly toward each other overhead, and the streetlights were warm and amber rather than white. Korean, which I suspected was not accidental. The sign above the door was modest, hand-painted characters, a name I could partially read from the years I had spent in Seoul absorbing the language in fragments and necessity. His driver was already outside when my cab pulled up. The man, broad, quiet, someone I didn't recognize from before, opened the restaurant door without being asked, which told me Minho had arrived first, and the staff had already been oriented to the evening's particular requirements. Inside, the room was warm and low-lit, smelling of doenjang and sesame, and something charred and good from the grill stations. It was genuinely full. Real diners, ordinary noise, the comfortable density of a neighborhood place that had earned its reputation without requiring it. And I was grateful for that. Public, as I had requested. Witnessed. Minho was at a corner table. Of course he was. Corner, wall at his back, sightline to both the entrance and the kitchen corridor. He stood when I approached, which was the kind of automatic courtesy that sat oddly on a man in his position, always had, and he looked at me for a moment without saying anything in the way that had once made me feel simultaneously seen and cornered. "You came," he said. "I said I would. You've said things before." It landed without cruelty, but it landed. I sat down across from him and arranged my napkin in my lap and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that which wouldn't open something I wasn't ready to open. He sat. His phone, one of them, was already face down on the table. The other, I noticed, was absent entirely, which meant someone on his team was managing whatever required managing tonight. He had cleared the evening deliberately. The observation moved through me, and I filed it away without examining what it meant. We ordered. He remembered, without asking, that I didn't eat shellfish, and redirected the server's recommendation smoothly before I'd had to say anything. A small thing. The kind of small thing that accumulated. "How long have you been in this city?" he asked. 2.5 years. Before that, Portland, for a few months, then here. He absorbed this geography of my disappearance without visible reaction. "You were thorough," he said. "I tried to be." "You were." A pause. It took my people 8 months to find any trace at all, and even then it was indirect. A record that could have been anyone. The candid admission of surveillance should have alarmed me. Instead, I felt something closer to a dark, complicated relief. The confirmation that what I had done had worked, at least for long enough. "And then?" I asked. And then I stopped. He said it simply. "Not because I didn't want to find you. Because I understood that you had worked very hard not to be found, and continuing to look was," he considered the word, "disrespectful to whatever decision you had made." I looked at him across the table. The candlelight caught the line of his jaw, the particular stillness of his expression, and I felt the old pull of him, not romantic, or not only that, but the pull of someone you have known in the hours when people are most themselves, unguarded and real, and briefly without the architecture they construct for the world. "That doesn't sound like you," I said honestly. Something shifted in his eyes. Not offense, closer to acknowledgement. "I know," he said. "I made changes." The food arrived. We ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised me, and which I suspected surprised him also. This discovery that 3 years had not made us strangers in every sense. The restaurant moved around us, other tables laughing and arguing and conducting the ordinary business of shared meals, and for a strange suspended interval, it was possible to sit there and simply be 2 people eating dinner. Then he said, "You're happy here." Not a question. "Yes," I said. "Good." He said it without irony, which was the most disorienting version of Minho, the one that meant exactly what it said. "That matters." "Does it?" He set his chopsticks down, looked at me directly. "Why did you leave, Evelyn? The real reason. Not the answer you've been preparing since yesterday." My hands were still in my lap. The restaurant noise continued around us, indifferent and ordinary, and I sat across from a man who ran an organization, built on knowing when people were telling partial truths, and I made a decision. Not impulsively, not from the flood of feeling the evening had stirred, but from the 3 years of living with a secret that had never stopped having weight. "I was pregnant," I said. The table went very quiet. Not because the restaurant changed. It didn't. The noise continued. The grill hissed. Someone laughed across the room. But because Minho became very still in the way that preceded his most serious attention, and the quality of the silence between us shifted into something with density and mass. "When you left," he said. His voice was level and careful, the way he spoke when he was managing something internal with great deliberate effort. I had found out the night before. I held his gaze. I owed him that. I hadn't planned to leave immediately, but it made things clear. Things I had been avoiding making clear. Things, he repeated. The life you lived, Minho. The things I knew, the calls I heard by accident, the men who came and went at 3 a.m. and left without explanation. I kept my voice even. I had been telling myself it was manageable, that I could exist in that space and remain separate from it. And then I found out I was going to have a child, and I understood that I could not raise someone in the margins of that world, even on the safe side of it, even protected. He was very still. A child, he said. The word sat between us. I watched him process it, watched the extraordinary discipline of his face hold, and then fractionally, not hold, a muscle in his jaw, the slight change of his breathing. Evelyn. His voice had changed. Lower. Something raw beneath the surface of it. A child. Children, I said quietly. Twins. A boy and a girl. They're 3. The color did not drain from his face. Instead, something moved through it that I had no single word for. A wave of something enormous and entirely without precedent in my experience of him. Minho, who had faced things I never fully knew and absorbed them without visible fracture, sat across from me in a small Korean restaurant and looked, for the first and only time I could recall, completely unprepared. 3, he said. February birthday. His hands came to the table, flat, pressed down, as if he needed the surface to be real. You left knowing. Yes. All this time. Yes. The silence stretched. Outside, I could hear a car passing on the cobbled street. Inside, the ordinary warmth of the restaurant continued without awareness of what was occurring at the corner table. I want to see them, he said. I know. Evelyn. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not the controlled authority, not the quiet danger, not even the rare warmth I had once known in the private hours. This was something underneath all of those things, something foundational. I want to see my children. I know, I said again. I've been thinking about nothing else since Tuesday. He looked at me across the table, and I saw in his expression the full weight of what I had carried alone for 3 years, reflected back at me from someone who was only now beginning to understand the shape of what had been kept from him, and what it had cost both of us to arrive at this table, in this moment, with this truth finally occupying the space between us where it had always belonged. His hand moved across the table, stopped just short of mine, not touching, asking, in the only quiet way he knew. I looked at his hand, then at his face. I'm not the same person I was in Seoul, I said. Neither am I, he said. I wanted to believe him. I was terrified to believe him. Both things were entirely true and entirely insufficient, and the restaurant moved around us warm and indifferent, while I sat with the most consequential decision I had faced since the morning I had zipped a suitcase and walked out of a life that had been beautiful and impossible in equal measure. One step, I said finally. I'm not promising anything beyond that. He nodded. His hand remained where it was, just short of mine, patient as everything about him had always been patient, which had once felt like safety, and had later felt like a net, and now felt like something I didn't yet have the word for. One step, he agreed. I did not take his hand, but I didn't move mine away either. I told the twins about him on a Sunday. Not everything, not the architecture of who he was, not the weight of what his name meant in certain rooms in certain cities. They were 3 years old, and what they needed was not a biography, but a truth simple enough to hold without dropping. I sat them at the kitchen table with their cups of warm milk, and I said, There is someone I'd like you to meet. His name is Minho. He knew me a long time ago before you were born, and he is someone important." Leah immediately wanted to know if he had a dog. Sue looked at me for a long moment with those dark, still eyes and said, "Is he the one from my drawing?" I said yes. He nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving information they had already suspected, and returned to his milk. I had asked Minho to come to a park rather than the apartment. Neutral ground, open sky, a place where small people could run, and the geometry of the meeting would not feel like an arrival or a claim. He agreed without negotiation, which was itself a form of restraint I hadn't been certain he possessed anymore. The willingness to accept terms set by someone else. He came alone. No driver waiting at the path entrance, no broad-shouldered men occupying the periphery. Just Minho, in dark jeans and a simple jacket, standing near the fountain at the center of the park, with his hands in his pockets, and an expression I could read from 20 feet away as something between controlled anticipation and genuine fear. I had never seen him afraid of anything. The twins ran ahead of me the way they always did, unaware that anything about this afternoon was different from any other Sunday. Leah made immediately for the fountain's edge to investigate. Sue stopped walking about 10 feet from Minho and simply looked at him. Minho looked back. I watched the moment from where I stood, unable to move. This man who had ordered rooms to fall silent with a look, who had conducted his entire life with a precision that left nothing to chance, crouching down to the level of a 3-year-old boy who shared his eyes and his stillness and his particular quality of attention, and saying something I was too far away to hear. Sue answered. Whatever he said made Minho exhale slowly and look at the ground for a moment before looking back up. Then Leah, finished with the fountain, discovered there was a new person in the vicinity and redirected her full energy accordingly. I watched her approach Minho with the fearless directness she applied to everything, say something emphatic that involved gesturing at the fountain, and wait with complete expectation for a response. Minho gave one. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and took his hand with the casual authority of a child who had decided a thing and saw no reason to make it complicated. He looked up and found my eyes across the distance between us. I have no adequate word for his expression in that moment. It was not happiness, though it contained that. It was not grief, though it contained that also. It was something larger than either. The face of a person confronting simultaneously what they had missed and what remained, and understanding that both were real and both required holding. I walked toward them. The weeks that followed were not simple. I had not expected simple. Minho extended his stay in the city. He found an apartment 12 minutes from mine. I knew the distance because he told me. With the transparency he had apparently decided was the only currency worth spending between us now. He did not appear uninvited. He did not send things to the apartment without asking. He texted before he called, and called only when he had something specific to say, which meant his communications were infrequent and without exception worth receiving. He met with me twice a week, always in the presence of the twins, and I watched him learn them the way he learned everything. Carefully, completely, with the full force of his attention. He learned that Leah required negotiation, rather than instruction, and that Sue needed quiet alongside company, and that both of them responded to honesty in the way that children do when adults respect them enough to practice it. One afternoon I arrived at the park to find him sitting on the grass with both twins in his lap, reading from a picture book, in a voice entirely different from any register I had heard him use before. Unhurried and warm and slightly silly at the voices, which made Leah shriek with laughter, and made Sue lean back against his chest with the boneless ease of a child who has decided somewhere is safe. I stood at the path entrance and watched, and did not announce myself for a long moment. He looked up and saw me. He didn't perform anything, didn't straighten or compose himself, or put the silliness away. He just held my gaze, and there was something in his eyes that said, "This is who I am now also. This is part of it." I sat down on the grass beside them, Leah immediately climbed across to my lap without interrupting the story, maintaining the narrative continuity with the pragmatism of someone who saw no conflict in wanting both. Sue remained where he was, tucked against Minho's side, turning the pages at the appropriate moments. We stayed until the light changed. There was a conversation we needed to have that we had been circling for weeks, and we finally had it on a Tuesday evening after the twins were asleep, sitting at my kitchen table with tea. Neither of us was drinking. "What you do?" I said. "That hasn't changed." "No," he said. "I can't pretend I don't know what it involves." "I know. And I can't raise them inside that knowledge, Minho. I can't have them growing up understanding what their father's name means in certain rooms." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were around the teacup, not drinking, just holding. "I've been in this for 15 years, he said. "I'm not going to tell you it ends tomorrow. I won't insult you with that." "Then what are you telling me?" He looked up. "That I'm building toward an exit, carefully, in a way that keeps everyone who matters to me alive in the process." A pause. "That it will take time I can't precisely measure, and that in the meantime, I intend to be present for them, for you, in every way I'm permitted to be, visibly, consistently. And if I decide that's not enough, then I will respect that," he said, "and I will still be their father. In whatever form you determine is safe." I looked at him across my kitchen table, in my small apartment, in the life I had built with great effort from the materials available to someone starting over. The peonies were long gone, but I had bought new ones, myself, from the market. A deliberate reclamation of something that had started as someone else's gesture. They sat on the windowsill in the plain glass vase, and the room smelled faintly sweet. "I'm not the person who left Seoul," I said. "I know. I don't need to be taken care of. I don't need things arranged for me. I know that too." He said it without defensiveness. "You built something real here. Alone. With 2 children and no margin for error." Something moved in his expression. "I am aware of exactly what that required, Evelyn. I'm not here to dismantle it." "Then what are you here for?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "To be worthy of being let in." The kitchen was very still. From the monitor, I heard Leah make a small sound in her sleep and settle. Sue breathed steadily and slow. I thought about 3 years of carrying something too large for one person. About the specific exhaustion of loving 2 small people with your entire capacity while keeping a separate grief locked in a room you never opened. About Sue's drawing, the figure on the side, waiting to be in the middle. "You have a long way to go," I said. "Yes," he said, "I know. And I will not wait indefinitely." "I'm not asking you to wait," he said. "I'm asking you to let me try." I picked up my teacup, drank, set it down. "The twins have swimming lessons on Saturday mornings," I said. 8:30. Sue is nervous about the deep end. Leah is not nervous about anything, which presents its own problems. Minho looked at me. Something in his face shifted into a stillness that was different from his usual kind, softer at the edges, like a door opening rather than closing. 8:30, he said. "Don't be late." "I won't." I believed him. Not without reservation. Reservations were the appropriate and intelligent response to everything this situation contained. But I believed him in the specific and important sense that mattered, that he would be at the pool at 8:30 on Saturday, and that he would learn which depth frightened Sue and stand at the edge of it until it didn't anymore, and that this was the shape of what trying looked like when performed by someone who had spent a lifetime operating without having anything to lose. He had something to lose now. 2 things, in fact. Small and loud and serious and entirely themselves. And perhaps, in the careful, unguaranteed, one-step-at-a-time way I had permitted myself, a third. He left at 10. I walked him to the door and he paused in the hallway. And for a moment, we simply stood in the ordinary threshold of my ordinary life. And he looked at me with the full weight of everything we had not yet resolved and everything we had, and he said, "Thank you for not disappearing again." I thought about all the ways I could answer that, all the complicated and honest things that were true simultaneously. "Go home, Minho," I said. 8:30 is early. He almost smiled. The real kind. The one that reached his eyes and stayed briefly and meant something. Then he went. I closed the door and stood with my back against it for a moment in the quiet of my apartment, in the smell of peonies and warm tea, and the sleeping child's stillness of the rooms beyond. And I felt, beneath the complexity and the caution and the very reasonable uncertainty, something settle. Not resolution, exactly. Not safety, in the uncomplicated sense. But the particular peace of a woman who had survived what she needed to survive, built what she needed to build, and had arrived at last at a morning that was genuinely, honestly hers, with all its difficulty and all its possibility still intact. The monitor hummed softly on the counter. I pushed off the door and went to check on my children,